My name is Avery Morgan. I'm 32 years old, and I was never one to believe in ghosts or evil spirits, at least not until last October. I wish I could say this story is just my overactive imagination, but even now, months later, I can't close my eyes at night without seeing twisted shapes behind every shadow. It all happened in Tennessee's Frozen Head State Park, near the small town of Wartburg, on what was supposed to be a week-long RV camping trip with three old friends, Bryce Johnson, Camilla Parker, who we all call Cam, and Elliot Hayes. Before I dive into the details of our trip, I should explain why I was there in the first place. I'd recently gone through a painful divorce. For the past few months, I'd buried myself in work and tried to forget the feeling of coming home to an empty apartment. My friends, who'd known me for years, invited me out on this excursion to reset, they called it. An adventure that might help me find the piece of myself I'd lost. I wanted to show them, and maybe myself, that I could still have fun, still find a spark of excitement in life, even after heartbreak. Bryce was the one who organized most of the trip. He's around my age, maybe a year older, and he's an avid outdoorsman, sometimes a little reckless. His dream is to start an outdoor survival YouTube channel, though I've told him more than once he'll have to tone down his daredevil stunts if he doesn't want to land in the ER. Cam is a slightly quieter soul, but brilliant, especially when it comes to folklore. She's studying Appalachian ghost stories for her master's thesis, so the idea of going somewhere rumored to have strange sightings excited her. Elliot, on the other hand, is the friend who always tries to lighten the mood with a joke, even at the worst times. You either love it or want to throttle him. Most of the time, we love it. The four of us set out in the RV that Bryce borrowed from his uncle. We figured we'd drive up to Frozen Head State Park, find a secluded spot, and spend a few days hiking, roasting marshmallows, and reconnecting with nature. Our plan was to stay from Sunday to Saturday, plenty of time to unwind. Right away, though, things started feeling off. Part of it was likely the tension of old friends reuniting under stressful circumstances. I was freshly divorced and moody. Bryce was anxious to prove his outdoorsy competence. Cam was excited yet on edge about the folklore. And Elliot was busy, trying to maintain the delicate balance between all our personalities. We arrived at the park in the afternoon, the sun still high over the ridgelines. Frozen Head is beautiful. Towering hemlocks and mountain laurels cluster thickly around the winding roads, giving you the sense that you're drifting through a dark green tunnel. The mountain peaks are tall enough to cast deep shadows even in daylight. The drive into the campsite felt like we were slowly being swallowed by the forest. Yet as unnerving as that sensation was, there was also a calmness, at least until we actually parked. We found a semi-remote campground near a lesser-traveled trail. The sign was weathered, leaning to one side. Bryce hopped out to check the ground and declared it flat enough for the RV. The rest of us stretched our legs, breathing in the pine-scented air. It felt good to be away from everything, even if I felt a faint prickle at the back of my neck that I quickly dismissed as city-born paranoia. The first day and night went by uneventfully. We set up a small fire pit, told some stories, and teased Cam for her spooky tales. She told us local rumors that made me uneasy. Strange flickering lights in the underbrush, elongated footprints in the mud, odd chanting at night. Bryce waved a hand, saying it was just superstition. Elliot chipped in with jokes like, "Maybe we'll find Bigfoot. Perfect for your YouTube channel, Bryce." But Cam had that analytical gleam in her eyes, as though she wanted to see something inexplicable so she could document it. At dawn the next day, Bryce insisted on a short hike to gather firewood from deeper in the forest. He said it was more authentic than buying bundles at a ranger station. Honestly, I think he just liked the idea of roughing it. I volunteered to go with him. Elliot and Cam stayed behind, presumably so Cam could do some reading, and Elliot could rummage through the RV for a breakfast he didn't have to cook over a flame. Bryce and I walked for about half a mile, the forest canopy thickening overhead. After a few minutes, we found a large pile of fallen branches by a rocky outcrop. I set my jacket down, and as I bent to pick up a smaller log, Bryce called out to me with a strange tremor in his voice. I stood and found him crouching in the mud, staring at the ground. That's when I saw the footprints. They were human-shaped, more or less, but bigger than my foot by a few inches. Each toe was elongated, ending in something that might have been a claw mark, though it was hard to tell in the half-dried mud. The weirdest part was the shape of the heel. It tapered sharply, like an animal's hind paw. Bryce let out a forced laugh and said, "Could be someone playing a prank," but he didn't sound convinced. We collected our firewood and returned to the campsite, both of us feeling unsettled. When we got back, Elliot was filming a short video with his phone, presumably for some comedic montage he liked to make after trips. Cam sat on a folding chair, flipping through a worn notebook. The second I told her about the footprints, she practically sprang to her feet, her eyes bright. "Let me see," she demanded. Bryce tried to wave it off, saying it wasn't worth exploring. We had enough firewood anyway, and it was too early to scare ourselves silly. Still, Cam's curiosity was piqued. That evening, the generator in the RV started acting up. It sputtered, the lights flickered, and Elliot smacked the control panel as if that would fix the problem. Bryce rummaged in a toolbox, messing with wires, cursing under his breath. Eventually, the lights steadied, but not at full power. I remember thinking it was no big deal, just one of those minor annoyances that happen on camping trips. But the deepening darkness in the forest made every flicker of light feel that much more ominous. When night fell, we tried to enjoy our second dinner by the campfire, but conversation kept drifting back to the footprints. Cam recounted an Appalachian legend about malevolent spirits, sometimes shapeshifters, that lure travelers off the trail. She also mentioned the Cherokee had their own versions of shape-shifting witches, but that was in different areas of the southeast. "Still," she added, "these mountains are old, older than we can imagine, and stories travel." She talked about the possibility of an evil spirit that could mimic voices, lead people away from safety, or cause sickness. Bryce rolled his eyes, trying to downplay it. Elliot just kept poking the fire with a stick, saying half seriously that maybe we'd get famous if we captured a real spook on camera. I, on the other hand, was torn. A part of me was intrigued. It was at least more interesting than sulking about my recent life changes, but another part of me was uneasy. Something about that forest, that night, felt charged, as though the air was brimming with something we couldn't see. Later, when we were drowsy around the dying embers, we heard a rustling in the nearby underbrush. At first, it sounded like an animal. Then came a low, raspy howl echoing off the ridges. It wasn't a coyote's yip or a wolf's howl. It sounded like a human voice forced through a throat not built for speech. Immediately, we all tensed. Bryce stood with a flashlight scanning the darkness, but the beam of light revealed nothing but tall ferns and the knotted roots of trees. Cam was practically shaking with excitement, scribbling a note in her book. Elliot mouthed, "What the hell was that?" We retreated into the RV for the night. At first, we tried to lighten the mood with a card game, but every so often, the generator would sputter, the lights dim, and we'd hear subtle whispers through the windows, as if the wind itself carried voices around the campsite. We ended up going to bed with uneasy hearts. I woke in the middle of the night to a faint scraping sound against the side of the RV. For a moment, I was too paralyzed to move. Was it the wind, a tree branch, or was something out there testing us? My head felt hot, my pulse hammered. After a minute of listening, the noise stopped, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination, perhaps a raccoon scratching around. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, we found new footprints around the RV, similar to the ones Bryce and I had seen in the forest. They circled the vehicle in irregular loops, as though someone or something had paced around us all night. We also saw faint scratch marks near the door. Elliot mumbled, "Great, we've got a trespasser," and tried to force a laugh, but no one was laughing. I remember the smell, too, like wet dog fur and decaying leaves. The air around the campsite felt tense, almost electric. Over breakfast, Bryce and I argued about what we should do next. Bryce wanted to march up the hillside and see if we could catch whoever was messing with us. I insisted we stay close to the RV. The last thing we needed was to get lost searching for a phantom. Elliot agreed with me, more out of caution than anything else, but Cam was harder to read. She listened to both sides, that thoughtful expression on her face, then said softly, "Maybe we should stick together and do a short exploration, just to see if we can find more evidence or tracks." In other words, a compromise. So we set off around midday, all four of us. Elliot carried a camera, Bryce had a survival knife strapped to his belt, and Cam clutched her notebook. We didn't want to go too far, so we followed the lesser-used trail near our campsite, which meandered deeper into the forest. Tall hemlocks towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked out much of the sunlight. The air smelled of damp earth. My heart drummed a nervous cadence in my chest. About half an hour in, Cam paused. "Do you hear that?" she asked. We listened. At first I caught nothing but the rustle of leaves and chirping birds. Then I heard a faint voice, calling from somewhere ahead in the woods. The voice was distant, echoing against the thick trunks. I couldn't make out what it said, but it sounded like a plea, maybe help, or a name. We all traded glances. Then Bryce spoke. "It could be someone who actually needs help, guys." His bravado overshadowed his caution, and he began stepping off the trail. Cam hissed at him to wait, but Bryce turned and said, "What if it's a real person in trouble?" I couldn't argue with that. So we followed, though my stomach kept twisting with every step. The further we walked, the more the voice seemed to move, sometimes off to the left, sometimes to the right. It was impossible to pin down. We stumbled through thick ground cover, nearly losing our footing more than once. Then, without warning, the voice stopped. We found ourselves in a small clearing overshadowed by a rocky ledge. Clumps of moss clung to the stone. The forest felt unnaturally quiet, as though something had pressed the mute button on the world. Bryce scouted ahead while Cam and Elliot tried to record or write down any details. That's when I noticed a bitter smell, like sulfur or rotten eggs, drifting through the clearing. My eyes watered from the pungency. Elliot winced, covering his nose. Then, from behind the rocks, we glimpsed movement, a tall shape, half hidden by brush. My heart soared into my throat. Cam let out a small gasp. Before anyone could speak, the shape stepped back, disappearing like a wisp of smoke. Bryce, in a moment of foolhardy bravery, lunged forward, calling out, "Hey!" But there was no response. We scoured the clearing for a solid 15 minutes, found nothing but more muddy footprints. I saw with rising dread that they were the same elongated tracks. We returned to the RV in a somber silence. Bryce was sullen, frustrated he hadn't found more, while Cam was scribbling furiously, her mind clearly racing with the possibilities. Elliot stared at his camera, complaining that the footage was just static whenever he tried to record in the clearing. I felt a chill I couldn't shake, no matter how many layers I wore. As night fell again, our generator trouble escalated. This time, the lights would fade to near darkness before sputtering back on. Bryce fiddled with the wiring, cursing under his breath. Eventually, he managed a patch job that gave us intermittent power. Cam's phone battery drained rapidly, even though it had been fully charged that morning. Elliot's camera started glitching, showing bands of static whenever he tried to play back any recordings from our trek. While Bryce continued cursing the generator, Elliot and I headed outside to feed the fire. The sky was a dim wash of dark blues, the earliest stars just flickering in. Cam was inside looking up old folklore references on her phone, whatever battery she had left. Elliot tried cracking a joke about gremlins in the generator, but I could see the worry behind his eyes. Neither of us really believed this was just faulty equipment anymore. The worst came after midnight. I was just drifting off in my bunk when I heard footsteps circling the RV. Soft, deliberate crunching leaves underfoot. I sat upright, my heart thumping so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The footsteps stopped near the door. Then a slow scraping noise, like nails raking against the metal. My mouth went dry. On the opposite side of the RV, Cam squeaked, "Is that you, Elliot?" Elliot, from behind me, whispered, "I'm right here," which meant nobody was outside among us, at least. Bryce, clutching his knife, took a few steps toward the door. We all froze at the next sound. The voice of Elliot calling from outside, "Hey guys, I'm locked out. Let me in." But Elliot was literally beside us, wide-eyed. Cam whimpered. Bryce shuddered. We all realized the voice outside was mimicking Elliot. I've never felt such a primal, icy dread in my life. The real Elliot shouted, "Who's out there?" But the only answer was that scraping noise again, more insistent this time. Then, with a violent thud, something slammed against the side of the RV. We heard a shrill hiss, almost like laughter, but twisted and gurgling. Bryce grabbed the door handle, pulling it tight so it couldn't open from outside. Nobody in their right mind would dare open it. Eventually, after what felt like hours, the noises stopped. We stayed awake till dawn, hearts pounding. We expected the window to shatter at any moment, or the door to burst open. But the creature, or the person, whoever or whatever it was, left us alone. At first light, we ventured out, armed with knives and the meager courage that comes from tired desperation. Deep scratches marred the RV's exterior. The ground was churned with footprints, the same elongated ones, but there were more now, as if a group had encircled us. Or maybe it ran around in circles, Cam muttered, voice trembling. Elliot swallowed hard, lifting his phone to document the damage, only for the battery to die. We stared at each other, dread sinking in. Bryce cursed. "We're leaving," he announced. "I don't care about finishing the trip." But the campsite was paid for, and we were still half convinced we could handle this. Stupid, in hindsight. But part of me worried about trying to drive those winding roads in the dark if the generator, or the RV battery, decided to fail. Besides, a twisted logic said, how far would we get before nightfall? By mid-morning, the tension among us thickened. Bryce kept blaming Cam's ghost stories for scaring us, though deep down, I knew he didn't really believe it was just a story. Elliot tried to crack jokes that landed flat. I found myself sniping at Bryce, telling him his bravado was going to get us killed. Cam, looking pale and drawn, tried to calm us, but it only made her seem more anxious. As the day wore on, we realized we needed a plan. We were short on water because the campsite spigot was a half-mile away, and none of us wanted to roam too far into the woods alone. Bryce insisted we make a quick run to refill our water jugs. We decided we'd all go together. Safety in numbers. We took a short footpath to a small pump near the park's boundary. Along the way, the forest felt oppressive, the tall canopy letting in only shards of sunlight. Every few minutes, the breeze carried faint whispers we couldn't place. Whether it was just the wind or something else, none of us dared to investigate. We reached the spigot, filled our jugs, and began the return journey. Cam was unusually silent, glancing over her shoulder at every little sound. I could tell she was trying to memorize everything for her thesis, but fear overshadowed her academic curiosity. Meanwhile, Bryce walked at the front, scanning the trees. Elliot hovered near Cam, camera clutched in his right hand, though it kept blinking low battery. I walked near the rear, noticing scuffed leaves and more footprints on the trail, some fresh, some half erased by our own footfalls. Then we heard it again, a voice calling from off the path. This time it sounded like Cam, gasping for help. But Cam was right there with us. "Don't listen," Cam whispered urgently, grabbing Elliot's arm. My stomach twisted. This was no random stranger messing around. This was something that could replicate voices perfectly, maybe to lure us away. Bryce whispered. "Keep moving." But the voice persisted, calling Cam's name again and again, edging closer to a pained cry. I saw Bryce's jaw clench. He was torn between wanting to help a potential victim and fearing the truth, that we were dealing with something supernatural. We sped up our pace, ignoring the voice, until it finally faded into the forest. We made it back to the RV, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Elliot tried to put on an upbeat face, suggesting we break out the last of our beers, but none of us were in the mood. Bryce rummaged in the RV for his uncle's flare gun, which we'd left stashed in a cupboard. He loaded it, muttering, "Just in case." Twilight arrived all too quickly, the sky bleeding into oranges and purples that sank into the horizon. The generator flared its final protests, powering the interior lights at half strength. We sat in tense silence, occasionally glancing at the windows. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end the whole time. I kept imagining those elongated footprints outside, waiting for us to let our guard down. That night, Bryce was the one who almost got himself killed. He thought he heard Elliot calling for help just a few yards away from the RV. Without warning, Bryce bolted outside, yelling, "I'm coming!" Cam and I scrambled after him, hissing for him to come back. Elliot, who had been in the bathroom, rushed out, confused, only to see Bryce disappearing between the dark trunks with the flare gun in hand. We sprinted through the underbrush, shouting Bryce's name. The darkness swallowed our voices. My flashlight's beam glanced off twisted roots and jagged rocks. My panic soared. The footsteps and whispering in the distance were relentless. We found Bryce near a narrow stream bed, disoriented, his arm bleeding from 3 deep scratches. His eyes were wide with terror. "It called me," he whispered. "I thought it was you, Elliot. It sounded exactly like you. I saw something tall. It grabbed me." He looked like he was fighting not to break down. We practically dragged Bryce back to the RV. His arm wasn't broken, just lacerated, but he was clearly in shock. Blood oozed through his torn sleeve. Cam did her best to clean and bandage the wounds. Elliot was trembling, though he tried to hide it. When I asked Bryce what he'd seen, he could only shake his head and mutter, "Too dark." It was tall, like I don't know. He had glimpsed enough, though, to be certain it wasn't human. That was the final straw. None of us wanted to stay another night in that cursed campsite. We decided right then, we'd pack up and leave in the middle of the night. Even if it was risky, even if the roads were winding, we'd rather take our chances than spend another hour letting that thing toy with us. The generator was sputtering again, the lights flickering ominously, as though the forest itself was draining our power. We scrambled to pack what we could. Elliot took a few last-second photos of the scratches on the RV door and Bryce's torn shirt, but the camera glitching likely meant we wouldn't have any real proof. While Elliot and Cam threw things into duffel bags, I tried to start the RV's engine. It coughed and spluttered before finally roaring to life. Relief surged through me. I glanced at Bryce, who sat in the passenger seat, pale and shaking, but determined to leave. The headlights illuminated the twisted forms of the trees, creating dancing shadows that looked almost alive. Cam and Elliot jumped in, and I pulled us onto the narrow dirt road. Every second, I expected some creature to leap in front of us. The beams of the headlights flickered ominously as we bumped along. The path was littered with branches, and at one point we had to pause to nudge a fallen log aside. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. Every snap of a twig made my heart pound. About a mile out of the campsite, we stopped once more. Something had caught on the rear bumper, scraping loudly. Elliot hopped out to kick it loose, cursing under his breath. I watched him in the side mirror, my heart in my throat, hoping nothing would spring from the darkness. When he finally got back inside, we tore down the road, pushing the RV as fast as was safe on the dirt track. The entire drive, I felt as though eyes were upon us, trailing us through the trees. Sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I thought I saw a gaunt figure matching our pace. It could have been my imagination, or it could have been something else. Each time we rounded a bend, I gritted my teeth, praying the engine wouldn't die. Gradually, the forest began to thin, the road widening. Finally, we reached a more main thoroughfare lit by sporadic streetlights. I almost cried from relief when we saw that first flickering lamp. By the time we got onto the nearest highway, dawn was brightening the horizon, painting the sky a pale gray. Nobody spoke much on the ride back. Bryce's arm needed medical attention, but the cuts looked shallow enough that we weren't worried about immediate infection. Though we'd definitely seek a doctor soon. Cam had tears in her eyes that she tried to wipe away discreetly. Elliot stared at the camera in his lap, not saying a word. As for me, I just focused on driving. My entire body buzzed with adrenaline and leftover terror. When we finally stopped at a diner on the outskirts of Wartburg, we slumped into a booth, exhausted. No one had gotten more than a few scraps of sleep. Bryce needed to wash his arm and get it wrapped more securely before we headed to a hospital. Over eggs and coffee, we tried to piece together what had happened. Elliot quietly said he'd lost most of his footage. His camera was glitching, the files corrupted. Cam's phone also had missing recordings. The only evidence we had were Bryce's scratches, the damage to the RV, and the nightmares scorching into our memories. What still chills me to this day is how real it all was. This wasn't just strange lights or illusions. Something physically attacked Bryce, taunted us by mimicking our voices, and circled our RV night after night. We left Frozen Head State Park, but whatever was there felt deeply woven into the fabric of that place. Ancient, malevolent, and powerful. We drove back to our respective homes that day, each of us numb with shock and exhaustion. Bryce ended up getting stitches for the deeper cuts. The doctor asked what caused them, and Bryce mumbled, "Something about a bear swipe." I don't think any of us could bear to tell the truth. Who would believe it? Over the following weeks, I tried to return to normal life. Work, groceries, bills, all the mundane routines. But I couldn't sleep properly. Every night I'd jolt, awake, imagining I heard that rasping howl outside my window, or I'd dream of elongated footprints circling my bed. Sometimes I heard the voices of my friends echoing in the darkness, calling my name. I'd fumble for a light switch, half sure. I was back in that forest. I stayed in touch with the others, of course. Bryce and Cam had grown quieter, as though the experience stole some spark from them. Elliot tried to joke about it once, calling it our own personal Blair Witch, but even he couldn't force a laugh. Cam told me she wrote a detailed account in her thesis notes, but decided to keep it partially private. She left out our names and the exact location, worried about drawing more attention to that place. The last thing any of us wanted was for some thrill-seeking amateurs to wander into Frozen Head chasing the same phenomenon. Months later, we still talk about it in hushed tones, as if saying too much will summon that entity back into our lives. Bryce has recurring nightmares where he's alone in the forest, hearing all our voices calling him from different directions. Cam refuses to go near any remote wooded areas now, though she used to love them. Elliot, uncharacteristically, has grown quiet and cautious. And me, I can't shake the feeling that one day I'll wake up and hear my own voice calling me from the hallway, demanding I follow it into the darkness. I've come to believe that the mountains in Tennessee are ancient and mysterious, that there are pockets of reality we barely understand. Maybe it was a shape-shifting witch from old Appalachian lore, or a restless spirit, or something that predates the stories altogether. Whatever it is, it's predatory and cunning, able to sense our fears and exploit them. The fact that it let us go might mean nothing more than it found us too difficult to break entirely. This time, will it truly leave us alone? I don't know. I sometimes think I see faint shapes in my peripheral vision, especially when I'm outdoors at night. I freeze, expecting a tall, gaunt figure to materialize under a streetlight. I spin around and find only empty air, but I can't tell if it's real or my own paranoia. All I know is that I'm changed. We all are. If anyone ever asks me about Frozen Head State Park, I can't just say, "It's lovely, you should go." I'd rather warn them. Stick to the main trails, and if you hear something calling your name at night, do not follow. If you see footprints in the mud that don't quite match a human foot, turn around. Don't linger after dark. Because some stories about the woods aren't just stories, and sometimes the darkness holds more than just animals. Sometimes it holds something that wants to lure you away from safety, to scare you, to hurt you, maybe even worse. I'm still Avery Morgan. I'm still 32, and I still have a life ahead of me. But I've left a part of myself in that thick forest under the hemlocks. A piece of my soul, perhaps, still wanders those moonlit trails, lost in the echoes of inhuman voices. And if I'm very unlucky someday, when my guard is down, that piece will come calling, telling me to leave the comfort of my home and walk into the shadows where it waits. My name is Cora Stevenson, and I'm 28 years old. Last year, I drove my old RV into the rural outskirts of Adams, Tennessee, hoping to capture some interesting footage for my modest online channel. My channel isn't huge, but I get steady traffic from people who love hearing about haunted history and urban legends. I've always been torn between skepticism and fascination. Part of me believes there are logical explanations for everything, while the other part of me has witnessed enough eerie events to remain open to the possibility of the unexplained. What happened in Adams proved to me that local lore carries more weight than I ever imagined. I arrived in Adams on a bright afternoon in late September. The sky was a faded blue, streaked with wispy clouds. Even though the land was still green, there was a faint crispness in the air, warning that autumn was near. I'd been on the road for a while, traveling alone, subsisting on gas station coffee and convenience store snacks. So, the sight of rolling farmland, tall oak trees dotting the distant edges, and an occasional barn rising against the horizon was a welcome change from the highway blur. I drove slowly down a gravel road toward the property of a man named Melvin Carter, a farmer in his mid-60s who had generously agreed to let me park my RV at the edge of his land for a week. He'd heard about my project through a mutual acquaintance in town, Maggie Hunt, the local librarian. I'd done my research about the Bell Witch legend, which many people trace back to these parts. The old stories claim a poltergeist-like presence once tormented the Bell family in the early 19th century, manifesting as disembodied voices, knocking, and even physical attacks. Over 2 centuries later, many still say the spirit lingers near the Red River. Given my interest in folklore, it felt like a prime location to investigate. I spotted Farmer Carter standing near his mailbox at the end of a dusty driveway. He wore worn jeans, a checked shirt, and a gray baseball cap. Lines on his sun-weathered face hinted at decades of farm work under the Tennessee sun. The moment I stepped down from my driver's seat, he approached with a cautious wave, as if worried he might scare me off. "You must be Cora," he said in a gravelly voice. "I got your call earlier this week. You can park by that clump of oak trees." He pointed. "You'll have some shade there and the ground's level. Just don't wander too close to the river at night. It can be tricky terrain in the dark." I thanked him and drove the RV over to the spot he indicated. I felt a surge of excitement tingle in my fingertips as I killed the engine. This was the start of a new adventure, my biggest attempt yet to capture something tangible for my channel. Though I've traveled alone for years, I always experience a mix of thrill and dread when first arriving at a new place, especially one steeped in ghost stories. I told myself it was only adrenaline. Melvin strolled over as I hopped out. He gestured for me to follow him a short distance from the RV. We walked through a patch of tall grass until we reached a wooden fence marking the boundary of a pasture. Beyond it lay the farmland that eventually sloped toward the Red River. In the distance, I saw an ancient barn leaning at a precarious angle, as though it might collapse at the next strong wind. Melvin said it belonged to his grandfather originally, and had seen better days. "You planning on filming out here at night?" he asked. not unkindly. He turned and gave me a look that carried both curiosity and concern. "That's the idea," I replied. "I'm a bit of a paranormal buff. I'm hoping to capture some interesting audio, or maybe even video, but if you'd prefer I keep certain boundaries." He shook his head. "I don't mind. Just be respectful. People around these parts grow up on these stories. Some believe, some don't. But if you stir up anything, I ask that you don't. Break nothing or cause a fuss." The seriousness in his eyes made my stomach flutter. "Of course not," I said. That evening, after I arranged the interior of the RV and made myself a simple meal, I set up my camera gear outside. The plan was just to record B-roll, shots of the farmland, the sunset, the old barn in the distance. I also had a digital audio recorder, a small device I use in case of unexplained noises, though I mainly utilize it to capture ambient sounds for my videos. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, the sky blazed gold and orange, a breathtaking backdrop to the quiet farmland. Cicadas droned, and the soft hush of the wind through the oaks gave everything a calm feel. I let the camera roll and perched on a fold-out chair with a notebook. My phone, propped up next to me, displayed notes I'd compiled about the Bell Witch history, incidents of knocking on walls, voices mimicking family members, objects moving on their own. I took a sip of water and tried to imagine what it must have been like for the Bell family 200 years ago, living in fear as a disembodied voice scolded them from empty rooms. The first night was uneventful, apart from the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of some small animal in the brush. Around midnight, I packed up and slipped into the RV. As I crawled into bed, I felt an odd prickle of anticipation, as if I were on the cusp of discovering something. I wondered if it was just my wishful thinking. The next day, I headed into town to meet Maggie Hunt at the local library. Adams isn't a large place, so the library itself was modest, a single-story brick building near the main road. Maggie was waiting inside among shelves stocked with worn hardcovers and local genealogical records. A petite woman in her 50s, she greeted me warmly, acknowledging she'd been hoping someone would come along and show renewed interest in the area's folklore. She led me to a reading table near the back of the building where she had assembled a stack of historical references, diaries, and newspaper clippings. Some dated back to the early 1900s, while others were from just a few decades ago. "These talk of the strange knockings and voices," Maggie said, tapping a slim, leather-bound journal. "And that's not all. People around here sometimes report seeing a figure in an old-fashioned dress late at night near the Red River or in certain fields. Could be the spirit of Betsy Bell or the so-called witch itself. Folks have different theories." I flipped through pages scrawled in spidery handwriting. One diarist wrote about hearing laughter outside their window in the dead of night. Another described the smell of sulfur preceding unexplained phenomena. I was too excited to be frightened just yet. I thanked Maggie and asked if she believed any of it. She paused, then smiled politely. "Let's just say I keep an open mind, dear. This town's history runs deep." Returning to Melvin's farmland that afternoon, I felt more determined than ever to collect evidence. That evening, I marched along the fence line with my camera, focusing on the old barn. In the golden dusk light, it looked both picturesque and ominous. My audio recorder was running. I captured crickets, the breeze, the occasional distant moo from a cow in a neighboring field. All normal farm sounds. Yet a part of me kept scanning the horizon for anything that might hint at the supernatural. When darkness finally set in, I hunkered down beside the RV again, trying a short monologue for the camera. It's my second night in Adams, Tennessee, near the site of the infamous Bell Witch haunting. So far, nothing to report, but local lore insists that strange knocking sounds and disembodied voices can appear at any time. I stopped talking mid-sentence. Somewhere behind me, I heard a soft rapping like knuckles on wood. Immediately, I clicked off the camera's record button. My heart thrummed in my chest. I stood and spun in a slow circle, shining my flashlight around. The farmland was empty, the oak trees unmoving except for the light shuffle of leaves. I walked a few yards away from my campsite, scanning the side of my RV. Nothing seemed amiss. Then, more raps, this time on the opposite side of the vehicle. I dashed around to that side, goosebumps prickling my arms. By the time I got there, the knocking had stopped, and no one was in sight. I swallowed, adrenaline rushing to my head. Could Melvin be playing a prank? Or perhaps it was a branch. But the sound had been too deliberate, like a knuckles' distinct echo. Still, I wrote it off as something natural, telling myself I shouldn't get spooked so easily. The farmland turned pitch black under a moonless sky, and I decided to call it a night. I climbed into the RV, triple-checked the door lock, and tried to review my audio recordings. The faint rapping had been captured, but it was so light it could just be anything. An animal brushing against the metal even. Shaking off my unease, I prepared for bed. Hours later, I jerked awake. A voice outside was calling something. My name, maybe. I held my breath, listening intently. The interior of my RV was dark except for the faint glimmer of the battery-powered clock near the sink. The voice came again, drifting through the thin walls, a gentle, almost friendly tone, yet distant. It reminded me of a woman's voice, though it was so faint I couldn't tell for sure. My pulse hammered. Every inch of my skin felt supercharged with tension. I got up, quietly slipped into my boots and grabbed my flashlight. I paused, debating if I should really open the door. Then I heard it one more time, a whisper. Cora. Cora. My name, drawn out like a gentle beckoning. I mustered my nerve and cracked the door open, shining the flashlight. The farmland lay empty, bathed in starlight. No shapes, no footprints, just a lonely breeze carrying the scent of dew-laden grass. Closing the door again, I wondered if I might have been dreaming, but my heart told me otherwise. I could still feel that presence, the sensation that something had been just outside. Morning came with no further incidents, though I felt exhausted from poor sleep. I decided to approach Farmer Melvin for an honest conversation. I found him repairing a fence post near the edge of his property. Telling him about the knocking and the voice made me feel a bit silly, but he didn't laugh. If anything, he looked troubled. He dabbed sweat from his forehead with a bandana. I told you, these parts are known for that sort of thing, especially if you go looking for trouble. The old folks say that if you're being pestered by knocks in sets of 3, that's a sure sign the Bell Witch, or whatever it is, wants your attention. So far, it's just been single knocks, then a couple in quick succession. I'm not sure if it qualifies as 3 distinct knocks, I said, feeling a strange need to minimize it. And that voice could have been, I don't know, maybe I was half asleep. He stared past me toward the distant river, eyes narrowed. Just don't provoke anything you aren't prepared to handle. Respect is key. You start mocking or challenging it, you might regret it. Then he pressed his lips into a thin line, ending the conversation. Later that day, around lunchtime, I headed back into town to chat more with Maggie at the library. She told me she had additional materials to show me, a family journal from the early 1900s that mentioned continuing hauntings in the area. She spread the journal open on a broad oak table. The musty smell of old paper reminded me of rummaging through my grandmother's attic as a child. I read through the swirling cursive, piecing together a story of a farmer named Henry Morrison, who claimed that at night he heard a woman singing outside his home. When he tried to record it on a cylinder phonograph, the device malfunctioned. He soon fell ill with a fever, and the weird singing escalated into loud knocks on the walls. The final pages of the journal trailed off, as though the writer had stopped abruptly. No explanation for how it ended. Maggie mentioned that local law says Henry recovered, but he refused to talk about the events after that. Walking out of B. The library, the midday sun felt jarringly bright. I clutched my notes, unsettled. My experiences so far were so small, mere taps and a faint voice. Yet these stories hinted at things getting worse if the presence truly decided to make itself known. I forced myself to remain logical. Old diaries and local legends can exaggerate. Perhaps I'd been influenced by the hype. That evening, though, logic felt harder to maintain. I set up more recording devices around my RV, one near the front bumper, another near the back. I also placed a stationary camera inside, pointed at the door, just in case anything tried to knock again. I felt a bit foolish, but thoroughness was part of my job. After a simple dinner of canned soup, I did a short walk around the farmland, capturing the hush of twilight on camera, how the oaks cast long shadows, how the barn's broken roof gaped like a toothless mouth. When full darkness arrived, I hunkered in my RV. I did a live stream for my channel, about half an hour of me discussing the Bell Witch legend. Viewers chimed in with enthusiastic or skeptical comments. As I spoke, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched, as though something hovered beyond the limited range of my RV's lights. Several times, I thought I saw movement near the barn, but it might have been an illusion of moonlight and swaying grass. After ending the live stream, I powered down my laptop and listened. The farmland was unnervingly quiet, as if the insects had decided to hush themselves. Then, as if on cue, knock, knock, knock. 3 sharp taps struck the side of the RV, distinct, enough to echo. My blood turned cold. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, calling, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer, only a slight breeze shifting the grass. I circled the RV, shining my beam of light along the metal surface, looking for dents or scuff marks. Nothing. Yet gooseflesh covered my arms. I remembered Melvin's warning about 3 knocks. My rational mind tried to dismiss it, but the pit in my stomach told me it was a sign, a deliberate message from something unseen. I felt a powerful urge to pack up right then and leave. But I forced myself to be calm. If I fled at the slightest escalation, I'd never learn the truth behind these legends. I returned inside, set up my camera to film, and pressed the record button, speaking in a whisper. It's now around 11 p.m. I just heard 3 distinct knocks on the RV. I can't see anyone outside. If this is the entity from local folklore, I want to communicate. I'm open to hearing you. I mean no disrespect. I paused, waiting. Nothing but the low hum of my overhead light. Exhaling, I sat down. Disappointment and relief fighting in my chest. Maybe I'd missed my chance to capture something. Then a sudden static crackled through my camera's microphone, so loud I flinched. The overhead light flickered. The air in the RV turned icy, as though all warmth had been sucked out. A faint hiss, a whisper, came from behind me. I spun, nearly dropping my camera, but I saw only the door and the small window leading out into the farmland's darkness. My name is Cora, I stammered, voice trembling. I'm here to document your presence. Fear and excitement warred in my brain. Was I actually addressing an entity, or just scaring myself? An intense pressure filled the space, making my eardrums feel like they might burst. I kept recording, but all I heard was that gentle hiss, as though breath was traveling across my ear. The feeling lasted only seconds, then it vanished. The air returned to normal temperature, my overhead light steadied, and the cameras crackling stopped. I rewound the footage, playing the audio back. My voice came through, then a burst of static, and under the static, a rasping sound that might have been a single syllable. I replayed it again and again. I couldn't make out words, but it almost resembled the shape of my name. Cora, mouthed by unseen lips. I slept fitfully, dreaming of a faceless woman drifting outside my RV, tapping on the walls, chanting a tune I couldn't place. I jolted, awake at dawn, covered in sweat. I was done trying to brush off the possibility that something was indeed happening here. That morning, I discovered the engine of my RV wouldn't start. It coughed once, then died. I tried 3 or 4 times, no success. I checked the battery, the oil, the fuel gauge. Everything seemed normal. Maybe it was just an unfortunate mechanical glitch, but combined with what had happened the night before, I felt a chill of helplessness. I found Melvin in one of his fields feeding some goats. When I told him about the engine trouble, he shrugged with sympathy. "Could be the starter. I can give you a jump later. I've got a spare battery pack." I spent the day wandering the property, too restless to sit. I found footprints in the mud along a damp patch near the river. They looked human, but were incomplete, as though whoever made them was barefoot, and they vanished abruptly. I snapped photos, but footprints in mud are not exactly conclusive proof of anything. Still, dread bubbled in my stomach. That same day, Maggie texted me, encouraging me to read a scanned portion of an 1800s diary she'd emailed. I skimmed it. It described how, after hearing repeated knocking, the writer tried to reason with the spirit by reciting a sort of apology or prayer. The writer believed that acknowledging the spirit's power respectfully could avert deeper harm. As night fell on my 4th day, I resolved to try a direct approach. If I truly was dealing with some extension of the Bell Witch phenomenon, maybe it expected humility, or maybe it was just an old tradition. I sat in front of my RV with a lantern, the farmland stretching into darkness around me, and spoke to the air. "I want to apologize if my presence here is an intrusion," I said softly, feeling self-conscious. "I acknowledge that this land has a history older than I can comprehend, and I don't want to disrespect it. If there's a spirit here, I want you to know I won't trespass beyond what I've been allowed. I won't mock your power. I only want to learn." The wind was still. Minutes passed without incident. Finally, resigned, I stood up and retreated inside, leaving my lantern to cast a small circle of light by the RV's steps. My nerves were raw. What if all this was just a series of coincidences, or local pranks, and I was letting my imagination run away with me? That question hovered in my mind as I set up the camera for another attempt at filming. Then the thunderous pounding began. Not gentle taps or 3 soft knocks, but a violent barrage against the RV's metal exterior, rocking the vehicle. I screamed, nearly dropping the camera. The overhead light fizzled out. Darkness swallowed me. The pounding continued. Boom, 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 like fists trying to tear the walls open. My heart slammed against my rib cage. I reached for the door, intending to fling it open, but panic seized me. Could I really face whatever was out there? A shrill voice erupted in the darkness, half laugh, half scream. I couldn't tell if it was inside the RV or outside. My camera's microphone peaked in the red zone as static and screeching overloaded the audio. Something unseen scraped across the window. In that moment, I truly believed I might be yanked outside into the farmland and never return. Desperate, I remembered the mention of an apology or prayer. In a shaky voice, I cried, "I'm sorry, I mean no disrespect, please." The pounding reduced to a single final slam, as if a door had been shut from the outside. My entire body trembled. I held the camera to my chest, tears in my eyes, quietly repeating my apology. Gradually, the static eased. The overhead light flickered back to life, dim but functioning. I waited, adrenaline roaring in my veins, for some final blow. None came. My only company was the sound of my ragged breathing and the quiet hum of the night, as if the farmland had returned to stillness. Several minutes passed before I dared move. The rest of that night was agonizingly silent. I sat up, hugging my knees in the corner of the RV, mentally replaying every knock, every screech. I checked my phone for the time, barely 2 in the morning. My exhaustion warred with terror, but eventually around 5 I dozed off into a fitful sleep. When sunlight pried into the window, I woke with stiff limbs and a throbbing head. Determined to leave as soon as possible, I tried my engine. It fired up on the first turn, no sign of malfunction. The immediate wave of relief nearly brought me to tears. I wasted no time stowing my gear, triple-checking I hadn't left anything behind. I found Farmer Melvin near the farmhouse to thank him. I expected him to be surprised the engine was working now, but he just gave me a knowing nod. "Sometimes if you apologize, the spirit'll let you be," he said quietly. "Safe travels, Cora." I shook his hand, genuinely grateful. I pulled out of his driveway, my tires grinding the gravel, and headed into the main part of town. My mind spun with a dozen unanswered questions. Did the presence respond to my apology? Why had it attacked so violently? Was it the true Bell Witch or some other entity that had taken up residence in these fields? Before leaving Adams, I parked outside the library one last time. I found Maggie inside, but she was busy with a small line of patrons waiting to check out books. She gave me a sympathetic wave, as if to say she'd heard or sensed that I wouldn't be staying. I mouthed, "Thank you," then slipped out the door. Somehow, I knew more conversation would just lead to more questions. My hands were still shaking on the steering wheel as I navigated the town's exit. On the highway, bright morning sun, streaming through the windshield, my phone dinged with new messages. Friends checking on my trip, channel subscribers asking if I'd do a new live stream. I stared at the phone, recalling how the camera had captured the most terrifying night of my life. Yet I wasn't sure I wanted to review the footage. The memory was too raw. Finally, somewhere south of town, I pulled into a rest area. My adrenaline had worn off, leaving me shaky and hungry. After forcing down a few bites of a protein bar, I decided to see what the camera had recorded. Sure, enough. The final video was half static, half incomprehensible shrieks. My screen flickered at the exact moment I remembered feeling that intense presence. In the final seconds, just before the pounding ceased, there was a barely audible phrase under the static. 2 syllables that might have been, "I accept," or just random noise. I watched it 3 times, but I couldn't be certain. With a sigh, I ejected the memory card. Part of me wanted to toss it out the window, to forget everything, but I knew I couldn't. This was part of my life's work, not for sensational views, but because I'd personally experienced something that transcended easy explanation. I slid the memory card back into its case. Maybe I'd release the footage in segments, or maybe I'd hold onto it for a while, letting the memory settle. Even now, tears prickled my eyes when I remembered the raw fear of that night. I continued my journey out of Tennessee, the farmland giving way to busier roads, the skyline of a bigger city eventually creeping into view. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had watched me leave, letting me go with the knowledge that I was spared, but only just. My mind reeled with the diaries I'd read, the stories from Maggie, the warnings from Melvin. It was as if the Bell Witch, or whatever the force behind that legend truly is, had reminded me how small we are in the face of old, unexplainable energies that linger in certain corners of the world. A few weeks later, I would sit in my apartment, editing the audio I'd recorded. Much of it contained soft knocks and static, but every now and then, I'd catch a fleeting hiss that defied explanation. I'd pause, replay it, measure the waveforms. My logical side insisted there must be a technical or environmental cause. The rest of me, the part that had confronted that pounding terror in the farmland, knew better. In the end, I published only a small portion of my Adams footage. I trimmed out the worst of my panic, cutting the video right before the poltergeist-like barrage. The narrative I presented to my viewers was cautious. Some knocks on the RV, static-laden audio that might suggest a whispered voice, references to local lore. I didn't want to sensationalize or exploit the experience. I mostly wanted to honor it, to acknowledge that something out there defied my attempts at neat categorization. To this day, I haven't returned to Adams. Sometimes I wonder if that presence or spirit ever tries to knock on other RVs, or if it only appears when it senses a skeptical visitor with cameras in hand. yet I can't deny the changes it wrought in me. I'm more humble about the unknown, more respectful of local beliefs, and less eager to press for proof when I sense something truly menacing might answer. I still travel and investigate haunted places across the country, but I carry a lesson from Adams. At times, our pursuit of proof can blind us to the fact that these legends aren't just dusty fables. They live and breathe in certain pockets of the land, waiting for the unsuspecting to knock or call. And if you should hear that knocking in sets of 3, or a voice whispering your name under a moonlit sky, remember my story. Remember that apology might be the only thing that stands between you and a darker fate. Because for all my gear and research, in the end, it wasn't science that saved me. It was humility in the face of something older, more powerful, and far less merciful than I ever believed possible. My name is Cora Stevenson. I'm 28 years old, and that's the story of how I discovered more than I bargained for in Adams, Tennessee, near the heart of the Bell Witch legend. The farmland may seem peaceful under the sun, but when dusk settles in and the voices start to whisper, you realize you're treading on centuries of echoes that still have plenty to say. I only hope that those echoes remain behind me, and that I've paid enough respect to keep them from following me wherever I go next.